my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I wanted to record a quick video redoing a little bit of my material that I did 3 years ago. I put out a response to the problem of evil. I kind of want to update that response here. Recording from my work office, so here it is. That's why the setting is a little bit different. And just as a preliminary, if you appreciate the content on this channel, it would help me out. It would give me more time to do material like this, to do it part-time. If you were interested in supporting as a patron or sharing this video, subscribing, and I hope this is helpful to you in your own pursuit of God. Now, the problem of evil can be stated along these lines. If an omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent God exists, then that God would want to stop evil and would be able to stop evil. And so why is there evil? Phrased as an argument, premise one, an omnipotent and all-knowing, omnibenevolent God would stop evil. If an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God exists, then evil would not exist. Premise two, evil does exist, therefore such a God does not exist. It's kind of a standard modus tollens, is a way of putting that argument. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. Now, how would we respond to this argument? Well, I'm going to situate what's usually called skeptical theism within a broader account of God's purposes. And this skeptical theism view sort of relies on what I'll call a greater good theodicy, what is often called a greater good theodicy. Now, skeptical theism says this: God very well might have a good reason to permit evil. So the atheist who makes this claim has to show that an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all-good God could not have a good reason to permit the evils he does. Now, the way an atheist might try to show this is by saying, well, God's omnipotent, and so he could actualize any good that he seeks without permitting evil. Otherwise, is he really omnipotent? But as theists have pointed out, omnipotence doesn't include the ability to do the logically incoherent. God cannot create a five-sided square, not because of a limitation on omnipotence, but because five-sided squares simply do not exist by virtue of the contradiction. So if that's the case, then the good that God might be after very well might require, logically, the permission of evil. Certain goods, for instance, require the existence of evil as something that good overcomes. So, for instance, the good of courage requires something in the face of which to be courageous. The good of bravery requires something in the face of which to be brave. So we can think of a class of goods that require the permission of evil for the overcoming of that evil, for that good to come into being. Well, I want to specify then this sort of approach. So this approach then presumes that God is after certain goods, a certain class of goods that require the permission of evil in order for those goods to be wrought in the world. Now, one doesn't have to follow the account I'm about to give here, but the account I'm about to give is drawn from sort of the wells of Reformed and Thomistic thinking, and it's kind of a summary of two of my articles here, and I'll link I'll email those to anyone who emails me and wants to see those. Now, let's think on if we think about the being and nature of God. God is the foundation of all that is good, all that is lovely. He is being, he is beauty, he is goodness in itself, such that all being, all beauty, and all goodness are what they are in light of their conformity to God's nature. So if God is the foundation of all reality, then he is the metaphysical foundation of the beautiful and the good and the true, and those things are what they are because they derive from God's being. Now, if we think about why God would create the world, presumably he'd create the world for a good reason, a good end. If God creates the world for a good end, and if his own being, conformity to his own being, is the essence of the good, then God creates the world for a God-reflecting reason. In other words, if goodness just is the reflection of God in the world, then when God adjudicates an end as a good end, he is adjudicating that end as a God-reflecting end. An end which reflects his own being. And therefore, God creates the world for a good end, i.e. a God-reflecting end. God creates the world to reflect his own being. And this was true, this is Thomas Aquinas' answer to the question, why did God create the world? This is also Jonathan Edwards' answer to why did God make the world, namely to emanate the divine excellencies into the world. So on this account then, God's being is the foundation of all axiology, and by axiology we mean value theory. God's being is the criteria of all value, all goodness, and all beauty. God creates the world, therefore, to reflect his own goodness, his own beauty, his own divine excellencies, portrayed in created things. And so this is where you get this account of the divine ideas. I've covered that in my prior Molinist, Thomas Calvinist video, that mouthful of a video. So within this view of the cosmos, everything around us then is sort of arranged, and the sequence of history is arranged to reflect the being of God. Which means that if God permits evil, God permits evil in the context of this world history, which reflects his own being into the world. So any permission of evil, therefore, is done ultimately for God to reflect his own divine nature. Now, to qualify this, it is true that there are lesser and greater reflections of God's nature into the world. So, for instance, Alyosha and in this famous scene in The Brothers Karamazov, there's this dialogue between, I think it might be Alyosha and Dmitri, but I'm forgetting, between two brothers. One of them's an atheist, more or less, and the other's a Christian. And the atheist says, look, if God permits one child to suffer, no good that God could permit could ever be worth the suffering of a child. I don't want that universe. I don't want whatever harmony is wrought from that. Now, here we have to acknowledge one thing. It is true that there are some evils that are so horrific that I can't think of a display of God that would justify permitting them. But my inability to conceive of the display of God that would justify the permission of any given evil does not mean that God couldn't have, that God's imagination doesn't include a way God's nature can be displayed in the light of the permission of any evil. Now, God gives us the kind of icon of this sort of act in the death and resurrection of Jesus. If we were to think of objectively the worst evil in history, just as it is worse to kill a human being than to kill a puppy, right, because of the greater dignity of a human being, the worst evil that was ever committed in history was the slaying of the Son of God, was the slaying of Jesus Christ, who is goodness incarnate. And yet, when we look at the resurrection, that unity that consists in the death and resurrection of Jesus, we can say, you know what? The crucifixion of Jesus was worth the glorious resurrection. The resurrection justifies God's sovereign orchestration and permission of the crucifixion. Okay, so that then provides a sort of icon. If God can do that with the worst evil that happened in history, then I can trust him with every other evil. That God would display the divine nature in the permission of every other evil. Now, we want to make a quick distinction here, and this is how I want to finish the video. We want to distinguish between God's permitting evil for a higher good and doing evil for a higher good. And the reason I want to make that permission is because when this sort of response is given, atheists will then often say stuff like, okay, well, you're basically saying that God can murder people so long as a good comes about. The end justifies the means. It's not what I'm saying. And here's why, right? Ethically, we all, I think, know that there is a difference between doing evil that good may come and permitting it that good may come. If I saw someone about to get robbed $5 and I got a blast of foreknowledge that my permitting that would lead to the attainment of all sorts of goods, maybe like it would trigger in this sort of butterfly effect-esque way the release of all these goods in creation, I might be justified in permitting that relative to the good it brings about. Or let's say a teacher permits a student to be bullied to a measure so that the student learns to stand up for himself, right? That's ethically different than the teacher bullying the student or me committing the robbery. So what we want to say is that God permits evil. He's never the doer of evil. He doesn't actively generate evil. He might sovereignly permit it and even orchestrate it at times, right? Acts 4 says that God predestined the acts of Pilate. But that predestination, God's sovereign decree over history, as I've covered in the prior video, does not eliminate human agency or freedom and does not imply that God causes evil. See my prior video. Okay, so God then permits evil that good may come, and therefore, when we think about things like both evils that happen to humans or animal suffering, then we have to say that it's part of God's design, God's good design, that problematic forms of suffering, right, things that actually generate real problems. I don't really think that, if I go for a walk and I have a slight ache, C.S. Lewis actually talks about this in The Problem of Pain. It's actually part of the pleasure of walking, and like to the point of having a slight ache to like sit down and then do something else. So problematic sort of versions of pain. It seems to me like we have to say that God's design for creation is such that there's no gratuitous suffering of that sort, and that if you hold to an old earth like I do, we'd want to say, I think we'd want to appeal to something like the activity of demonic agents in corrupting the development of species. I'm going to do probably a larger video on that once I've done a little bit more reading in that area. I think it's a defense worth exploring, that the very structures of the development of species actually have been corrupted in certain ways. Tolkien has actually an analog to this when he sort of portrays in the Silmarillion orcs as corrupted elves. I think we can actually give a kind of account that's actually even plausible in light of the irreducibility of consciousness. Getting off track anyway. But what we want to say, to bring it back, is that God permits evil in order to bring about the display of his divine excellencies. And if someone says no display of God is worth it, right? Well, they have to reckon with the fact that God's self-display, at least internally, right? If they're lobbying this as an internal critique of Christianity, then God's self-display, God's own being, is the source of all that is valuable, all that is good, all that is lovely. So it's to say that the display of goodness does not justify, the display of value is not valuable. The display of goodness, of ultimate goodness, of the highest good in reality, is not highly good enough. So the response then leans into the fact that God permits evil in order to bring about the display of his being. And because the display of his being is objectively the most valuable thing in reality, God displays his being in ways that justify the permission of given evils relative to that particular evil. And we have an icon of this in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So I hope this is helpful to you. Let me know what you think in the comments. Go ahead and push back. If you do have a critique, like, subscribe, and I hope the Lord blesses your day. Thank you so much.